Welcome in, everybody, and we have a very special broadcast today, as you might expect from the Torch News Roundup. And it's a very sad broadcast, one that we all knew was coming, but never would really be prepared for. As we remember Stan the Man Lee, the Generalissimo, who passed on this week at the age of 95. Truly the end of an era. There is never going to be another Stan Lee, not quite like Stan Lee. And it's it's a sad day for comics most of all, but it's a sad day for just literature in general, I would say. And I wanted to take a couple of days to kind of internalize it and get my thoughts ready. I don't have any notes or anything here. But we're going to look over the life of Stan Lee. We're going to talk about some of the milestones through his career, his illustrious career. Some of the sadder moments in later years we'll touch on briefly, but we kind of just want to celebrate the man right now. And Stan Lee gave so much to all of us. I think whether we know it or not. I mean, there might be some people that don't consider themselves comic fans or superhero fans. If you like Star Wars, you owe a debt of gratitude to Stan Lee. If you like uh, video games, you owe a debt to Stan Lee for his contributions. I mean, there really isn't a corner of pop culture, I don't think, that was somehow influenced by this man. And, you know, my first reaction was thank you, Stan. And I think we all should, particularly anybody in the comic book industry, should start any memoriam of Stan Lee with thank you, Stan. And of course, my whole uh, imaginative cognizance it is founded on things that I learned from Stan Lee. My imagination at a very young age was fostered by the imagination of Stan Lee, the creations of Stan Lee. And that's why I owe him a very big debt. And I am a cartoonist primarily because of Stan Lee. And just to give my own personal eulogy, if you will. I learned how to read at 3 years old. My mother, God bless her, taught me to read through reading me comics at 3 years old. And of course, there were also DC and, maybe the odd Archie or Harvey comic as well, but they were primarily Marvel comics and Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four were among my favorites. And so my earliest memories are of Stan Lee comics, even if it wasn't the ones he wrote. I think I was most fond of his run on The Amazing Spider-Man. I read that more when I was, a little bit older. Let's say from 10 on. I went back, or maybe 8. I'm not sure, but I started reading the. I'm trying to remember what the reprint line was called. Marvel Tales, I believe. Marvel Tales. They used to reprint the original Stan Lee, the Lee Ditko, Lee Romita era in the mid 80s, I believe. And I started really reading them, and I found myself enjoying them, the Lee Ditko slash Romita era, more than what was, coming out at that point in the mid to late 80s. And so the work of Stan Lee captivated me, from a very early age as well, knowing, his particular brand of writing. And he was a very literate writer, a very literature-esque writer. He wasn't afraid to use the big words. He wasn't afraid to use, you know, some kind of stodgy phrases that would be found in Shakespeare or mythology or the Bible. He was, very adept at weaving this kind of great literature together into a simple morality tale, a superhero story of good versus evil. But he still managed to give it a very literary feeling. And that's something that I always admired. That, again, this is something that we won't see anymore, I don't think, in this day and age. We won't see writers weaned on the classics, on, you know, mythology, Shakespeare, the Bible, things like that. You don't really find too many writers these days that are sort of taking their initial imagination from that. It's more, we're getting it now more secondhand because of the greats like Stan Lee and all the others that had already brought it to us, and we're sort of getting that secondhand. But this was the first generation. This was the real imaginative creators, and Stan Lee was one of the greatest. Personally, my earliest memories, beyond being read the comics, was the Incredible Hulk TV series with Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby. Still one of my all-time favorite uh, television shows of all time. I don't have a whole lot of images up here, but we're gonna change the image every once in a while to try to. This was the TV movie that had Thor meeting the Hulk, which is actually my favorite. My favorite segment of that entire run was the Hulk Thor movie, and it was just fantastic. But we'll go into that another time. But my earliest memories were of watching The Incredible Hulk with Bill Bixby, Lou Ferrigno, and that really was what sparked my interest in comics. My mother knew how, interested I was in the show, how much I loved the show, and she just started reading me comics as bedtime stories because I wanted to see more of the Hulk. And of course, I had the animated series of Spider-Man and the Hulk in the early '80s, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. And again, my earliest memories of Stan Lee are probably. I also remember the '60s show that was being rerun at the time, um, on a daily basis, like in the middle of the afternoon. But my earliest memories of Stan Lee himself have to be, of course, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which I would watch every Saturday morning, early '80s, and of course the Incredible Hulk, of my favorite character, and his narration, opening and closing the episodes. You got a real personal feeling from Stan Lee, and that's part of what made him so great. So, so far we've talked about him as the writer, but he was also great as it doesn't really give him justice to call him the personality, but the personality of Stan Lee is really what sold the Marvel comics in their original run when when Marvel first took off. It was that feeling of Stan is just not he's not just the writer. He's not just sitting there writing these things for a paycheck and sending them off, not caring who is reading them. You got the sense very easily that Stan was writing this for you. He was writing it for himself, but he was writing it for you. And he cared if you liked it. And he wanted you to like it. He wanted you to read it. He wanted you to watch the cartoons. And you got that sense from him that he was a very caring and hands-on creator, which really didn't happen back in the day. And even to this day, in present times, that feeling is completely gone from, the big two. But particularly at that time, he ushered in this feeling of Marvel Comics was a family. Marvel Comics was a group that you joined, and you enjoyed it because there was fellowship. There was fellowship with other fans that got it, that understood what he was doing. And, it was just that sense of joy. That's the only way I can really put it. The sense of joy that you got from the product and he got from presenting the product. And that was something that was, I think, probably indigenous to him alone. I don't know of any other. I'm hard pressed because a lot of my heroes, Walt Disney, George Lucas, Jim Henson, but Stan Lee really stood head and shoulders in his presentation, the way he presented himself and his product. It was, pretty much unheard of before and since. Yeah, I'm gonna be jumping all over the place here, but just once again trying to encapsulate my thoughts, my feelings. Stanley is my hero. He'll always be one of my heroes, my creative heroes. And like I said, we all owe a huge debt, a massive debt to what he's done. He created a universe, a complete universe. And, it wasn't completely by himself. And there's always going to be contention from fans that Jack Kirby is largely responsible and Steve Ditko is largely responsible. And so many, of course, of the artists and some of the writers are largely responsible. But you can't tell me that Stan Lee was not the creator. He was not the focal point of the creation of the Marvel Universe. He originated it. It would not have lasted and flourished under anybody else. And I'm not going to throw anybody else under the bus, but I am telling you the honest truth when I tell you that Stan Lee is responsible for the Marvel Universe. It would not have lasted without him. It would not have been a success without him. He is the one that brought that spark to those issues. He is the one that fostered the Marvel bullpen and the familiarity that fans got from the Marvel comics. That was not something that could be, generated elsewhere. That all generated from Stan. And of course, Stan was the mastermind behind all these characters. The creation of these characters came from Stan. He came up with Spider-Man. He came up with the Hulk. He came up with the Fantastic Four. He brought Captain America back out of obscurity. Captain America is one of the, I would say, one of the most popular Marvel characters right now. He would have languished in obscurity had not Stan rescued him, because of course Captain America is a creation of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. But quite honestly, we wouldn't have Captain America without Stan. He would still be a relic of the past. He would be there with the Whizzer and Miss America, maybe turning up in some you know uh, you know, some kind of side story somewhere. But he wouldn't be the icon he is today, Captain America, without Stan Lee. And of course, the multitude of heroes he created. Thor, he brought straight from Norse mythology and created a whole comic book style mythology from the Norse mythology, as we see right here. Just perfect imagination to do something like that I don't think anybody else would have thought of. And so as as the years went by, I I wrote to Stanley. I personally wrote to him for his 90th birthday because I did realize that we're all mortal, and unfortunately he's not going to be with us forever. So I do take comfort in the fact that I at least wrote most of what I'm saying here to him, and I hope he read it. I know he got hundreds of thousands of fan letters every day. I wasn't really expecting him to write back, but I did hope that I would get some kind of acknowledgement that he did read it, because it did mean a lot to me that I did tell Stan all this and how important he was to me, both in my creative endeavors, my creative imagination, and basically what he's done for the landscape of pop culture, of comics, of everything he's done that really nourished the imaginations. Well, now we're probably three generations in that Stan Lee has touched the creative minds of so many, and I'm really happy that I did that. And hopefully, I can hope in my heart of hearts that he did read it, and uh, I'm very sure that he knew how much his fans loved him, and I believe he truly loved the fans back in kind. I think he did everything he did with a mutual sense of love and appreciation, and that is the greatest gift I think that he could receive, and that we could receive, is that there was mutual love between he and the fandom, and he felt it, and we felt it. All right, so let's talk just a couple of seconds. Excuse me. Well, I have a sip here to refresh my vocal cords. And we're going to talk all about Stan Lee in this Torch News Roundup. We're not going to do any other subjects. They're going to have to wait because Stan the Man deserves a whole episode unto himself. So Stan, of course, Stanley Martin Lieber, uh, you know, he joined Timely Comics. Everybody knows the story, but let's just give a brief overview of his life. Joined Timely Comics. Publisher Martin Goodman, who was a relative, I believe, gave him a job when he was like 17, 18 years old. And he first began working as sort of a gopher for Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, who, of course, were creators of Captain America, as I said. And I had just finished reading, as a matter of fact, about a month ago, I was reading Joe Simon's autobiography. And he was talking of how a young Stan would sit and play a flute in the corner, and Jack Kirby wanted to strangle him. It was quite funny. But they gave Stan his first assignment in Captain America, where they needed a 2-page prose story in order to get the sufficient shipping rate for a comic to be distributed through the mail. So they gave him a story that he created for Captain America called, if I remember correctly, Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge. And it was a 2-page story, and it was Stan's first written assignment for comics. Nobody really thought anything of it at the time, and he called himself Stan Lee at this point because he was hoping that he would be a great American novelist, and used his real name there. Later, they began giving him more issues of Captain America. Enter World War II, where he enlisted, of course, and served our country greatly, as all the early day comic writers and artists did, of course. And he was in splendid company there with Frank Capra, Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, William Saroyan. A lot of, as they were deemed playwrights, were with him in the army. Then he returned to Timely, and at this point, it was a very it was the Wortham years. It was a very different landscape for comics, and it had grown very stale, very saturnized, you know, and we have then the creation of the Marvel Universe. Of course, Stan, as he told it, was going to quit, and of course, his wife Joan encouraged him to write a comic book story the way he would like to have it seen. Martin Goodman at the time had encouraged him to write a story of a comic of group superheroes, because Justice League had been popular at the time. And uh, Stan came up with the Fantastic Four, the first creation of the Marvel era. He began Marvel Comics at that point. And of course, the Fantastic Four is one of the greatest. And of course, he titled it the world's greatest comic magazine. But it truly was legendary. It was a breakthrough in many ways. He broke down all the barriers that they had put up for comics at the time. I mean, he had the temerity to have superheroes without masks, with public persona. That wasn't something that was really done, at least very often, if at all. The hero and the leading lady being married, he got fully into that, which was something that didn't occur very often as well. So there's a lot of boundaries that he broke with the Fantastic Four to begin with. Uh, then, of course, my favorite, the Incredible Hulk, where he took the concept of Jekyll and Hyde along with the Frankenstein monster, made the Incredible Hulk one of my all-time favorite characters, the misunderstood monster, the the pathos of it. And then, of course, probably his greatest creation, Spider-Man, which was the everyman character, and to an extent, he still is. And he defied convention there as well by making Peter Parker a teenager and not a sidekick, which was something that was not done at the time as well. It's just, an amazing array of characters that he created at this point. Also, around this point we had the X-Men. He created the X-Men, of course, and this is where a lot of people now that are going to try to, you know, disrespect Stan, let's put it that way, and you know who you people are. Stan Lee defied convention in so many ways, but in his blind optimism, he was one of the optimists. In his blind optimism, he saw to it that there was going to be, fair representation in comics. And that was part of what he did with the X-Men, where there was not going to be bigotry tolerated. He was going to show that, hold a mirror up, if you would, to, how, life was in the 60s and how it was wrong to be bigoted against another race of people. And that was, that was one of the soft selling points of the X-Men. Of course, the great thing about Stan Lee was none of his work was very preachy, which is something that lacks sadly today. But it was, of course, in the text. It was in the story. In reading between the lines, you could see very clearly that that was the message: tolerance. And of course, the Stan Lee soapbox. I'm seeing it retweeted a lot in the past couple of days. And of course, it was, I think, maybe arguably, but it was his greatest soapbox, where he, spoke out against racism and said, basically, you can't have one person represent an entire group of people. If someone did you wrong in some fashion, you can't hate the entire race of people or religion of people or whatever. And that, of course, was a very important message that I think reached many people because Stan said it. Um, then we have, of course, the Black Panther and the Falcon. He was breaking barriers there and having black superheroes for the first time, not only being created but being given a free uh, spotlight, have the spotlight put on them. Uh, of course, the Silver Surfer was a character near and dear to his heart because he did have that optimistic sort of naivete, to look at the world like through the Silver Surfer's eyes and say, why can't these people get along? Why can't the people of the world be grateful for what they have, because they have so much and they seem to want more, and they seem to not respect each other and be grateful for, the lives they have that are, by most accounts privileged. So that was another great creation. Just taking a look at a handful of his creations, he just made so many great characters. Iron Man, of course, we wouldn't have now if it wasn't for Stan. And Iron Man is sort of an unsung Marvel character back in the day. Nobody really liked him, but back in the day, he wasn't that very popular as he is today. But Stan, of course, he knew that, a billionaire making, munitions and war material and stuff, he took a chance on that, and he actually made it an endearing character. And it's amazing that basically everything he touched turned to gold like that. He could defying convention again. Daredevil, again, another one of my favorite characters as well. I always loved Daredevil. He was trying to do something different there with a handicapped superhero. How often did you see a handicapped hero? Professor X, Professor Xavier in a wheelchair. These are things that were not seen in comics at the time, and very rarely since, I suppose. But let me talk about the writing of Stan Lee again for a second. But this is what I think was his greatest gift, which was, and everybody knows part of this, which is he humanized his characters. Now, particularly in the 50s, this wasn't done very often. Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman would sort of go down Central Park in a parade, and everyone would throw flowers at them. For the most part, that didn't happen in the Marvel universe. Everyone was struggling. Peter Parker, particularly, struggling to get the bills paid, and the Hulk's creation was basically a curse on Bruce Banner. He was living under a curse, and the Hulk, of course, was cursed as well, that he could not live separate from Banner. He had to hope that Banner would go away for him to come back. And the Fantastic Four as well had so many problems with either money or family disputes, people arguing and fighting with each other within the family. These are things that was a touch of humanity that were brought to the comics from Stan Lee that wasn't done by anyone else at the time, particularly, but it was a very refreshing take on the superhero genre. And this is what really ushered in the Renaissance era. It's sort of called the Silver Age, I suppose, but this is basically the Renaissance era of comics. And I think one of the things also you have to remember is Stan, and again, this is not like to put him down in any way, but Stan was the master of melodrama. Now, melodrama is not a bad thing. A lot of people, you hear that term and you kind of think, well, it's meant as a put down or something, that real drama is real drama, a melodrama is just sort of a pot boiler or something. But to do melodrama well is not easy. And Stan Lee mastered it. He made melodrama perfect. He gave the perfect example of sort of B movie entertainment, but taking it to another level, so that the stakes were always so high. But no matter how high the stakes were, that Spider-Man had to fight Dr. Octopus, otherwise the world was in danger, he still had to take care of Aunt May. He still had to work for Jameson. He still had to try to sort out his love life. These are things that he mastered in the form of sort of a soap opera entertainment. Soap opera is trite. We don't think of that as something to be like lauded as some great literary work, but he took the concept of the soap opera, the daily serial, and he, you know, put his own unique stamp on it and turned that melodrama into gold. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't really realize as well, is he took that sort of old Hollywood kind of B movie-ish type thing, but he brought it to the big screen. He had sort of the Andy Hardy problems with Peter Parker. He had the Errol Flynn type charm with Tony Stark. He had the John Wayne war movies with Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. He knew how to took like a great big screen blockbuster and distill those elements down into comic book pages. I don't think anybody had ever done that and tried to think as big as he did and put these thoughts, these ideas on paper and give us, like I said, big budget blockbusters in the comics. This is something that really wasn't done. All right, so all right, let's talk about the moving on here to the more modern age, the modern era. Let's talk about the cartoons. This is when the 60s Spider-Man cartoon came around, and we had it was sort of a primitive style of animation. Not this, of course, but we're talking about the 60s Spider-Man cartoon. Spider-Man, the famous theme song, and I think it was called the Marvel Heroes, which was a show that had in turn different heroes like Thor, Hulk, Iron Man, Namor, I believe. And that was the first foray into the world of animation for Stan's characters. Then, of course, the Fantastic Four, which was a little more sophisticated, came out. But the big breakthrough came in the late 70s when Spider-Man got his own show. Spider-Woman got her own show. A lot of people forget that. That was nearly as popular, or if not more popular, I think at the time, because I remember Spider-Woman a lot. The original Spider-Man cartoons of the 70s, I don't remember them too much, but then again, I was watching them on like replay. You know what I mean? I'm not old enough to really remember all the 70s. I mean, I just remember the reruns of the stuff from the 70s and the early 80s. But then came Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. We had The Incredible Hulk, my favorite. Loved both shows. And like I said, that kind of ties into what I was saying. When you watched the drama that you got from something like Spider-Man and The Amazing Friends and The Incredible Hulk, that wasn't really kiddie fare. Even with, you know, it being different from the comics, of course, the market of animation, they still held pretty tightly to the concept of the comics. I mean, you didn't have deaths, of course, like Gwen Stacy and Captain Stacy, but they really kept to the core of these things, of these the sort of the core principles of Spider-Man, and they kept to them pretty much in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and it went down as one of the greatest. I mean, like I said, they changed things around by adding Iceman and Firestar as co-stars, and you had Ms. Lion for some of the kiddie appeal, but it really was very much taking the concept of Spider-Man seriously and bringing it into animation for the first time. Really, uh, I think it was on par with some of the greatest comics that were written about Spider-Man, and of course the Hulk. And then I think probably the best Spider-Man TV show though was the Spider-Man, the animated series from the 90s, where this image comes from. This was Stan's first, I believe, his first cameo, his first full-fledged cameo in something. No, 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 no. I think that was Trial of the Incredible Hulk. I think that might have come out first. Yeah, where he was the foreman on the jury for the Hulk. Yeah, but so that was the first live action one, at least. This was a cameo in the last episode of the series where Spider-Man met Stan Lee in an alternate universe, and it was really cool. And I just really love that series, the Spider-Man, the animated series, because it felt the most like a serialized Spider-Man animated show. You know what I mean? It felt like you were reading an issue of a comic in front of you, in full live movement. You know what I mean? So that's probably one of my favorites. Of course, as I said, bringing this was Stan bringing his properties to Hollywood. We had the Incredible Hulk show, like I said, which was a big blockbuster. They tried a couple of things. They did the Nicholas Hammond Amazing Spider-Man show, which I liked. Stan didn't like it. He wasn't very proud of it, and of course, it wasn't the greatest representation of Spider-Man. But I thought for its time, Nicholas Hammond was a good Peter Parker, and the climbing up walls and daring do was kind of on par with what you could do in the 70s. You couldn't do a whole heck of a lot with the special effects, especially on a 70s TV budget, but that was, that was, I think, a worthwhile endeavor. I wish they would put that show on DVD. I would love to see it, but I don't know what's holding it up. I know Stan wasn't a big fan of it. Perhaps it wasn't a big, uh, a priority for Marvel. Of course, there were others. The Captain America shows with Reb Brown. They were two made-for-TV movies. Didn't really take off very well. They weren't very good. And, of course, a Doctor Strange movie, which was also kind of subpar, to say the least. So that's early Marvel Hollywood, where Stan was trying to get his creations off the ground into, film and television. Didn't work out too well. Then several years had gone by. Nothing was coming of the projects. The Incredible Hulk, like I said, had gone off the air, but it returned several times with TV movies, guest starring Thor, guest starring Daredevil, which I liked both of them. And of course, they killed off the Hulk, intending to bring him back, but that's another full story. Bill Bixby passed on, and that sort of went by the wayside. They were going to do a She-Hulk television show as a spinoff. That kind of went by the wayside as well. Then nothing for several years. Spider-Man movie was in the works with Leonardo DiCaprio and James Cameron. never came to pass, which, to be honest with you, if you've seen the script of that movie, you'd be thankful it didn't come to pass. That it just wasn't good. But finally, well, starting with Blade, a lot of people say that the Marvel movies really started with Blade. Uh, Technically, I suppose they did, but the real kickoff, of course, was the X Men in 2000, I believe, the X Men, and that takes us to the more or less the modern era, which is the Stan Lee cameos. Everyone loves the Stan Lee cameos. And X-Men, of course, Bryan Singer was a real big hit. Then came the Raimi Spider-Man franchise, which was also a big hit. And at this point, Stan was just sort of the walk-in cameo. You know, he was doing the Alfred Hitchcock. You just pointed him out on the side and said, "Oh yeah, look, there's Stan Lee." Eventually, the cameos grew, and particularly under Kevin Feige, once they got into the MCU, they became to be little bits. I mean, they weren't long bits of screen time, but he would have some kind of funny gimmick to do that, would involve dialogue and stuff. If you want to know my favorite Stan Lee cameo, you're looking at it right here. This was from Spider-Man 3, a movie which I like, by the way, even though a lot of people want to bash it. But this was my favorite cameo, where Stan meets, like I said, arguably his greatest creation, Peter Parker, and tells him, one person really can make a difference. And enough said. So that I think encapsulates everything that Stan stood for, and I think that's the way to best remember him from, you know his work in the films and in the cameos. Of course, he always joked about wanting to have a cameo Oscar, and that would have been nice to have him receive in his own lifetime. I don't know if they'd do it posthumously, but and the cameos continue on. From what I understand, uh, it's been confirmed that Stan has a cameo filmed for Avengers 4. And if that is his last one, that might be fitting, because that's going to be sort of the end of an era for the MCU. Nobody knows at this point really who's going to come back, or how many, if the original cast of the Avengers does come back. But I think Kevin Feige has hinted that they have a few things planned. I think probably, my brother even said this, but probably we'll still see the Stan Lee cameo in one form or another, like the Netflix shows where you see a picture of Stan on the wall, or you'll see Stan in a newspaper or something. I'm sure the Stan Lee cameos will continue in one way or another, but it would be nice to think that Stan filmed a few cameos left for us that haven't been used yet, or maybe there's something on the cutting room floor that could be, brought out as a fun little memento, so to speak. All right, so this is the early years of the Marvel films. He was in Daredevil and Ang Lee's Hulk, which is terrible. And then, of course, we had the MCU movies, the creation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He became a mainstay, doing cameos in all of those films. And he still had the odd cameo in other films, Fantastic Four, several of the X-Men films called him back. He was also in Deadpool, and most recently Venom. So yeah, he to look at his resume for film, he did quite a lot. He had quite a few credits under his belt at this point. And of course, he had lent his voice to video games. He had uh, lent his visage to animation and did cameos in animation. He was in the Spider-Man cartoon, if I remember correctly, of several years ago. So he didn't stop at any point. There's a lot of jealousy, I believe, for Stan Lee, that people are jealous of him for his high profile. And again, I don't really see why. I can't see how anyone could bash Stan Lee. The man was as humble as they come, and you know, his behavior was beyond reproach. And we'll talk about this for a second now as we're winding down, but honestly, his behavior was beyond reproach. And in this comic skate era, well, I don't want to talk too much about that, but you know, he was quite firmly on the side of comic skate, because when you look at what a lot of these, NPCs are doing. They're bashing him because he came out and said, if a character is created one way, you keep them that way. You don't change them to make them gay. You don't recast them with a black actor. You keep the character the way he was originally created, or she was originally created. And you can create, I know, big shock, surprise, you can create a new gay character, a new black character, a new uh, female character, whatever you want. And Stan came out and said that and was quite firm in his beliefs in that. And that's basically all that Comicsgate really was saying in the case of diversity, is that don't force diversity by trying to change characters and trying to alter something from the way it was created. All right, so in his later years, Stan also did a bunch of things. Let's try to recount some of the things he did. He also he did some things for POW Entertainment. I believe there was a lot of problems he had with people, unscrupulous people, giving him difficulty with his company, Stanley Media. We're going to get into that in a second with some of the more unscrupulous things that happen. But he did some animated movies that were pretty good. There was The Condor, which was okay, and more to the point was Mosaic, which I really liked. I was hoping he was going to do a sequel to that. He did two or three more that I haven't seen, so I don't know. But yeah, that felt to me very old school Stan Lee. That felt like some real Lee Kirby stuff. I think if you watch that, find that Mosaic, the animated movie. I think if you watch that, you'll see what I mean. You'll get that feeling for old school Marvel, an old Lee Kirby comic that they made into live action, and it's about a girl played by Anna Paquin, who played Rogue, of course. And I don't know. She meets an alien and she gains like chameleon powers or something. And there's like old lost civilizations hidden in the earth and stuff. It's a lot of fun. So I think that's one of his best last creations. He did some other things, Stripperella, which is not exactly the kind of material I kind of want to remember from him. He also did something that I enjoyed, at least for the first season, which was Who Wants to Be a Superhero, which painted Stan as sort of the Donald Trump in The Apprentice, where he would, school a bunch of fledgling superheroes, which was allegedly a contest. But, let's face it, this was just a work of fiction. And I enjoyed the first season a lot. And, he'd put a bunch of people, actors, I guess, through their paces, and he would judge them on their costumes, judge them on tasks, on their behavior with civilians, and there was a mole in the ranks, and it was a real fun show. I kind of hoped that would have gone on too, but like I said, they did two seasons. Second season was sort of just, it kind of lost its charm somewhat, but the first season was really cool, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Then as the years went on, of course, he was still the leading voice of comics. He was the ambassador of comics. He did the I always get the title wrong. I say it out of order, but I think it's Mutants, Monsters, and Marvels with Kevin Smith. Of course, I love that. That is basically a conversation with Stan Lee, with Kevin Smith, and it's basically, you just feel like if you were there at Stan's home, some Sunday afternoon eating lunch, and he just goes through every story that he knows, like over the course of like an hour and a half or something. And I honestly, I love it, and I watch it like practically every once a month. But that was something that I really enjoyed that Stan did in his later years, which he gave us a lot of interviews, and it was quite you know for someone in their golden years to give so much of themselves, quite generous of him, I think. and he still did the conventions. He did them quite, frequently, even at his older age. So, now, let's just talk briefly here about more recent years. Talking about Stan's later years. Uh, so, of course, he and his wife Joan, he was married with her for over 70 years, I believe. And the passing of Joan, and of course, we all knew that was going to take its toll because, they were so close. And whenever the spouse of someone that's been with the other for so long, it usually takes its toll on the health of the surviving member. But she passed on about a year or so ago, and that was the beginning of the problems that sort of began happening. Some unscrupulous managers and attendants, or what have you, hangers on, if you would, end up giving grief to Stan, and they seemed quite clearly to be overworking him at this advanced age, making him do conventions, lengthy signing appearances. Uh, some people holding him up, I think, coming to his house holding him up. People making fraudulent accusations of harassment. All these sad things that he really didn't deserve to go through at the end of his life. And that's why a lot of people are still angry. I don't want to uh, dwell on that too much and wallow over it. There was also the story of him having blood taken and being mixed into the artwork, something that Stan did with Kiss back in the 70s, was going to be done again to sort of boost the popularity of comics or something that they were selling. So a lot of sad things happened for a couple of, probably over a year, that worries that Stan wasn't being treated well. Of course, his daughter JC, his one child with Joan. There was also allegations that there may have been elder abuse there, which Stan denied, and I have no reason to disbelieve him. But it did make for a pretty sad, a pretty sad final few months, that we were all kind of expecting that his health was not the best, and this kind of added pressure on a 95-year-old was not going to, you know, be very good for him. So in the most recent, they shut him off from communicating, which was a scary moment. And Kevin Smith, especially to his credit, was the one that stepped up and said, "Look, I'll take Stan in if he's not being treated well here." But they sort of kind of cleared that up, and he started doing videos again, just brief ones, and you could tell that his health was not the best. um, he was still very sharp, very you know, on the ball mentally, but you could tell the energy was drained from him, and his breathing was kind of laborious, and he didn't look to be as fit, to be able to jump up and walk around and do simple tasks. But he was still very much mentally aware. I was just reading an article before I did the start of the show, where Roy Thomas, who was sort of the man that Stan left in charge when he stopped writing the scripts and stuff in the early 70s. And he said that he had seen Stan the Saturday before his passing, which was on Monday. And he said Stan was still very much alert, and was happy to see him. They went over some old times and looked through some books and stuff. And he also said that Stan was very anxious to do more cameos, health providing that he was up to it, but he was eager to do more cameos. So that's great to know that he still was, looking forward to life and enjoying doing something for the fans. But yeah, then sadly we found out on Monday that he in fact had passed on, and leaving JC and Larry Lieber, his brother, whom he collaborated with on several books back in the day as well. Thor, I believe Iron Man. He did the Spider-Man comic strip with him for several years. Roy Thomas and ended up helping out with that. So, you know, I take comfort in knowing that Stan is now reunited with Joan. Um, they also had another child that didn't survive past a week, Jan, that they're reunited with. And, you know, Stanley really left us a legacy, a great legacy that will never be forgotten. And, you know, it's just so much that he's given that I don't think any of us could really repay what we owe Stan from all these great creations. So, excuse me for a second here as I take a little H2O. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. And what do you remember about Stan? What is your favorite Marvel character or character that he created? What is the greatest moment of his legacy? Because we've gone on for a while here now, and I could take up probably days going through each and every, you know, aspect of his legacy, things that he's done for the industry, the creations he's made, the associates he worked with. It's just so much for one person to have given us. So, uh, thanks for the joining in on this very special end of an era tribute to Stan the Man Lee, our Generalissimo. And once again, let me know what you think and what you remember about Stan most in the comments below. And from my own personal eulogy, once again, I just want to say I love you, Stan. I'm going to miss you a whole lot. You know, watching the Marvel movies are not going to be the same without cameos from the Generalissimo. And just thank you, Stan. Thank you for all you brought to us. Thank you for, you know, inspiring so many people, inspiring my mind from an early age, making me the imaginative person that I am. And there would be no Bullets Bourbon without Stan Lee, you know? There would be no comics, no comic creators for the most part, because very few of them would exist without Stan Lee. There would be a dying industry without Stan Lee. And we needed Stan Lee then, and we need Stan Lee now. So once again, this is Johnny Torch. Enough said. And this one's for you, Stan. Excelsior!